intersecting claims from sources that have nothing to gain and everything to lose from making a false claim become powerful evidence that an event happened.
Wrong. They become powerful evidence that those sources are convinced that the event happened. Hey YouTube! Today's video aims to address the notion that claims themselves are evidence for a given event, which Trent uses to declare the truth of the Bible. And at the end, I will also explain what can convince me that God exists and that Christianity is true, because there seems to be a lot of debate on the idea that atheists have an unrealistically high standard of evidence when it comes to accepting God's existence. This is gonna be a bumpy one, so grab a chill pill because we have a lot of bad analogies and even worse statements to go through.
Intersecting claims from sources that have nothing to gain and everything to lose from making a false claim become powerful evidence that an event happened.
John claims that he saw a UFO in the night sky 2 days ago, and by UFO, John means an alien spacecraft whooshing across the sky. Is this claim evidence that John actually saw an alien spacecraft? No, it's not. Instead, it's evidence that John saw something that he interpreted to be an alien spacecraft, because then you ask John to describe what he actually saw, and he says it was a bright light moving very fast across the sky, to which his prior bias added a lot of extra baggage like alien and spacecraft. So if you would have taken his claim as evidence for the alien spacecraft, you would have been wrong, because that bright light could have been anything from a drone to a satellite, airplane, a shooting star, you name it. And before you get this clarification from John, his initial claim isn't evidence for the alien spacecraft, but for something that he describes as an alien spacecraft. This distinction is important because we know that people can become convinced of false things being true. So we cannot take their honest and selfless claims as evidence for the truth of the event, but only as evidence for their mental states, aka they are being truthful and honest. And just like John's example showed, they may be truthful, honest, and wrong.
If 3 strangers in a public park all independently went to the police and said that Smith indecently exposed himself, most people would consider that proof Smith committed the crime, even apart from other facts that would confirm this unrepeatable event, like surveillance footage. That's why we can make a case for something like Christ's resurrection based on claims from people like Paul, who saw the risen Jesus, and the gospel authors who knew the disciples.
The critical difference between Smith's case and Christ's resurrection is the confirmation part. Your statement is that most people would take the stranger's claims about Smith's indecent exposure as sufficient proof that Smith did it, even absent of, I quote, other facts that would confirm the event, such as surveillance footage. I don't know where you plan to go with this analogy, but I'll tell you where you actually ended up. In a contradiction. The real problem here is that in Smith's case, you cannot conclude that he's guilty based on 1. Those 3 claims alone, and 2. What people think about Smith based on those 3 claims alone. You need additional confirmation of Smith's action to establish guilt, and the perplexing part is that you've admitted that by stating the need for additional confirmation evidence as the surveillance footage. So by your own account, it doesn't matter what people believe about Smith based on those 3 claims. It only matters whether we have confirmation for those 3 initial claims. But you don't apply the same standard to Christ's resurrection. In that case, you only have claims to work with. You don't have any means to confirm Christ's resurrection like you do in Smith's case, yet you reach the same conclusion in both cases. So you either accept that Smith is guilty of indecency based on those 3 claims alone, just like you do for Christ's resurrection, or you demand confirmation for Christ's resurrection apart from the claims, just like you do for Smith's case. You need to apply the same standard in both scenarios if you want to remain consistent. Otherwise, you're just guilty of special Christ pleading. Now, the next analogy shows that Trent isn't only confused about the nature of the evidence, but about the very nature of the thing that needs proving.
Consider the proposition, "My father has a headache." That is a claim about reality. It's an assertion that a certain proposition is true, and it serves as evidence that the proposition, "My father has a headache," is true. In medicine, the claim that a person is in pain is often the only evidence a person is in pain. Now, sometimes it's weak evidence, like if the person isn't sincere and you can see they're trying to get like pain pills to sell to other people. But if someone sincerely makes a claim about an invisible reality affecting him, and he has nothing to gain in making that claim, then that's evidence for the invisible reality that he's talking about.
Okay, Trent, but do you understand that there's a difference between someone making a claim about a subjective experience that they're having in their head and an objective one that takes place outside of their head? There's a reason why we take people's claims for granted when claiming that they have a headache, but we don't do the same when they claim they've seen an alien spaceship in the night sky, or that they've seen someone returning from the dead. Those are claims about the external objective world that we can investigate and that we should investigate before attaching a truth tag to them. Not only because they're claims about the world outside of the individual's subjective experience, but because the claims themselves are extraordinary, aka they defy our current understanding of the universe, which the claim "I have a headache" doesn't do. Furthermore, if someone claims that they can communicate with God, for instance, this isn't the same as them claiming they have a headache, despite both things happening in the individual's head. You know why? Because communicating with God implies the idea that God, as an entity separate than the individual, exists somewhere in the objective world around us. Pain does not. Pain is just a sensation, the individual's neural input firing in specific situations. It doesn't exist as an entity separate from the patient. So let's not try to draw parallels where parallels cannot be drawn.
In many cases, the confirmation for a claim is just another claim. How do I know my friend bought a new car? Well, there's a new car in his garage. Ah, but what if he stole it and did not buy it? Well, there's a title that has his name on it. But this is just a government document that claims he bought the car, and claims aren't evidence, right? What if it's a fake title? Well, I can go to the seller and he can tell me. But once again, we have another claim.
This is a very disingenuous statement. I understand that your point is to eventually make your opposition say, okay, but at some point we need to be reasonable and conclude that the friend did indeed buy the car, even if we cannot prove that exhaustively. At which point your gotcha moment would be, aha, so you're willing to accept that something is true based on claims alone, in the case of the friend's car, but you're unwilling to do the same for Christ's resurrection. This means that you're treating those claims as evidence because that's exactly what they are. The problem is that you're failing to see the bigger picture. The friend provides the car, the transaction document, and the government issued papers with his name on them, and these are direct evidence of the claim that he bought the car. The fact that you're equating these pieces of evidence with claims to force your unreasonable point is a you problem. Furthermore, you don't have anything even close to this type of evidence when it comes to Christ's resurrection. All you have are the claims that Christ resurrected. I would argue you don't even have that. You have a book claiming that there are claims about the event. You have no way of confirming whether the event actually took place. You cannot access Christ either to subject him to medical investigation to see that he is indeed capable of coming back from the dead. So because you found yourself in this pickle, instead of admitting it, you attack the evidence in the car case and make it look like they're also essentially just claims. This would allow you to say, see, we really only have claims in both cases, and if you accept one case as true based on claims, you should accept the other one on the same standards as well. And because I don't believe you're stupid enough to make such a stupid point, I have to assume you're disingenuous. And I'm not sure which is worse. And finally, we have one last analogy to discuss, which somehow manages to be even worse than the previous ones.
In some cases, background knowledge is enough to disprove a claim. Saying everyone in Arlington National Cemetery rose from the dead contradicts our background knowledge that those bodies are still in the ground. But when it comes to the resurrection, there is no background knowledge that says Jesus did not rise from the dead or he's still in a grave. The relevant background knowledge is that dead people stay dead. And that knowledge makes Jesus' resurrection a miracle.
What a load of nonsense. Two problems here. The first one is introducing your bias where it doesn't belong. Your position is that we cannot accept the claim that the people from the Arlington Cemetery rose from the dead because we can check to see that the bodies are there. This suggests that had the bodies not been there, your only explanation would have been that those people rose from the dead. You've ignored the possibility that someone may have stolen the bodies, or that aliens teleported them on their ship, or that they simply dissolved into the ground, leaving no trace behind them. Bodies don't usually do that, but these did. How did you eliminate these possibilities so that you're only left with resurrection as the sole explanation? The second one is the subtle shift of the burden of proof. In your cemetery analogy, your position is that we cannot accept that the claim that people rose from the dead is true because we can disprove that. So, because we can prove that the claim is false. But what would have happened if we couldn't prove that the claim is false, Trent? What if for some reason we couldn't check the graves to see whether those people are there? According to your own words, the alternative would have been to accept that the claim that those people rose from the dead is true because we couldn't prove it false. This is exactly why you then invoke the resurrection and state that since we cannot prove that Jesus didn't resurrect, as we did in the Arlington analogy, the obvious conclusion is that Jesus' resurrection is a miracle, which in other words implies the idea that it did happen. This is a shift of the burden of proof 101, because you're saying that if I cannot prove that Jesus didn't resurrect, then he did, and that's not nice of you. To end this section on a clear note, I understand why Trent wants to make claims evidence so bad. It's because when it comes to Christ's resurrection, all he has are claims. Would be nice if he could turn them into actual evidence, wouldn't it? Not only that, but it seems to me like Trent isn't using claims as mere evidence for the resurrection, but as actual proof, because he's a Christian and his position isn't that the claims about Jesus' resurrection make it more reasonable to believe that the resurrection took place. Instead, his position is that the resurrection did take place and that Christianity is true, and he points to the biblical claims as the actual proof of that. So he's only using the reasonable bit as smoke and mirrors to shield his actual belief, which is that the resurrection did happen. And he does that because he recognizes that it is unreasonable to conclude the truth of something based on sheer claims and nothing more.
One objection is that theists, all they have to do to prove God exists is just offer repeatable, testable predictions of the God hypothesis, and that would prove God exists. This is basically saying, well, if you can scientifically prove God exists, then atheists would change their minds. But what is science? Like, what is science? Science is the search for natural explanations of observed phenomena. If we could show something was testable, predictable part of our world, whatever effect that might be, like let's say only Catholic priests can change water into wine when they say certain words. Say we do show that. Why wouldn't we conclude this is just an unexplained part of nature? This objection is basically saying, I'll believe a supernatural being exists if you can prove it is a regular part of the natural world that we observe.
You've just made the case for why the concept of supernatural may be not only non-provable, but even absurd. It seems to me like you're painting the notion of supernatural to be synonymous to that which we haven't discovered yet and seems to violate the known laws of the universe. Because, isn't it so, once we discover that which we consider supernatural, we immediately consider it part of nature once we understand how it works. So, it becomes natural. Like, say we consider the ability to be in multiple places at the same time as supernatural, sort of like Dr. Manhattan does in Watchmen. But now imagine such an entity actually is born and we get to study it and we understand the mechanisms that allow it to be in multiple places at the same time. By explaining the mechanisms and linking that ability to the current laws of the universe, we essentially prove its natural foundation. It takes place in the natural world and it is explained by the natural laws. And even if we can't explain how that ability works, it still takes place in the natural world. So the most coherent and reasonable stance would be, this is most likely a natural ability, we just haven't discovered how it works yet. And you know that this is the right position to hold because you actually have real-world examples of such a situation. We've all seen those secluded tribe people who come into contact with a mirror or a photography and they conclude it's supernatural, but we know better. So, not understanding how something works isn't enough to call it supernatural, even if it violates or appears to violate the known laws of the universe. This reasoning implies the idea that the notion of supernatural is not only absurd, but quite literally impossible to demonstrate. And I agree with you. Well, the problem being that you don't actually believe this. Instead, you believe atheists unjustifiably dismiss the notion of supernatural and assume natural explanations are more likely. Except that, as you've shown and I've agreed, they're completely right to do so. Okay, so given the knowledge that we cannot prove the supernatural, what would convince me that God exists? I'll let Matt Dillahunty answer it for me.
I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a God. But if there is such a being as a God, then one would think that God knows exactly what would change my mind and should be capable of taking the action to present the case that would change my mind. And this hasn't happened.
Indeed, this has been my position for a long time. However, I have a different answer today, and that would be the afterlife. Let me explain. If I were to die and end up in heaven, wishful thinking, am I right? I would obviously believe that I'm dreaming, or hallucinating, or that I'm out of the matrix, you name it. However, as time passed and things remained the same, and I learned more about the new life, I would eventually come to terms with it. I don't know how long that would take, because that would be a paradigm shift that I would need to become accustomed to. What I mean by that is the fact that I would have all the memories of my former life and moment of death, so I would know that what I'm experiencing there is a new life following this one. So it would be natural for me to think that there could be yet another life coming after that, in a way that it is not natural for me to think that right now, because right now I have no experience of any past life. So it will naturally take me some time before I would accept that yes, that is heaven and that God exists, if I do meet him and he explains and shows me that everything that the Bible postulated is true. To be clear, I wouldn't be 100% certain that what I'm experiencing is 100% true, but it would be reasonable for me to believe it is. In other words, that new life still wouldn't solve the hard problem of solipsism, but at least I would accept it to be an objective reality, sort of like how I accept the current reality as objective. And I'm sure that this isn't an unrealistic standard of evidence for religious people like Trent, because after all, they believe that the afterlife is real. Naturally, my standard of evidence implies the idea that no human could convince me that God exists through sheer philosophical discussion, not because I have an unreasonably high standard of evidence, but because none of the evidence I've come across so far are actual evidence for God and nothing else. And if by any chance theists claim that my standard of evidence is unreasonable, I would urge them to provide some other piece of evidence that they think is just as decisive. I haven't seen any yet. And we finally reached the end of the video. If you enjoy this type of content and like to watch me struggle to form coherent philosophical ideas, subscribe, like, share, and tell me how much you love me in the comment section. I'll look forward to your input. Peace.